Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Whitney, and I'm moderating this, not moderating, I'm introducing our moderator in the panel. I am, just to let you know, that this panel's focus is called Building a Big Tent. And it's focused at building inclusive communities, and that really requires a deep intentionality in partnerships, communication, and vision. So our panelists are going to speak about that from their each individual perspective, and then also from the overall arching idea of how you build communities and really bring people together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce to you our panel, first our moderator, and then the panelists. And then they are going to have a period of time to ask some questions of each other, engage in conversation, and then at the end have a Q&A. When we do the Q&A, my request is just wait till I get to you with the microphone, because in order to get on the video, you'll need to have the microphone in hand. So I'll run around like Oprah and get some exercise while I get your questions. So first of all, our moderator, Lien Diaz, let me just pull it up, is the director for Constellations Center for Equity in Computing at Georgia Tech. Let me say it again. Founding partner of the Constellations Center for Equity in Computing at Georgia Tech. She brings an essential core foundation of equity to computer science education in her role as the Director of Educational Innovation and Leadership, and specifically focusing on working within national, international, state, and local education systems. She's joined to her right. Sorry, my little machine here. I've tried to figure out how to use this and not use paper, because I'm really about trying to not print things, but there's definitely like the tech, the CS problem with that, which is if I had a piece of paper, like my text messaging wouldn't be popping up, and we could solve that problem next. The next person to her right is Janie Fernandez, and Janie works at the National Center for Women and Information Technology, also known as NC-WIT, as the K-12 Alliance Manager and Tecnolochicas program. Did I say that right? Tecnolochicas. And NC-WIT, as you know, is the largest organization devoted to broadening participation in computing in the United States, and one of the largest organizations devoted to broadening participation of women, underrepresented minorities, and people with disabilities in all STEM careers and education. To her right is Chad Womack, who is the Director of STEM Initiatives for the United Negro College Fund. And in his role as director, he manages a portfolio of STEM programs, including the STEM Scholars Program, which is a $40 million commitment to support academically talented African-American high school students pursuing STEM as majors in careers and college, in a 4-year partnership with Google and other leading tech companies. And to his right is Beth Rosenberg, founder and director of Tech Kids Unlimited. Beth is an educator who works with teachers, students, technologists, academics, parents, families, and schools. She has worked on curriculum strategy development, program outreach, interpretive education exhibition materials, partnerships, collaborations between cultural organizations, communities, and schools. She is an advocate for students with disabilities and the founder of Tech Kids Unlimited, an educational technology not-for-profit program for special needs youth. On the screens are their Twitter handles, so you can tweet to them and also use the hashtag #InfyXroads. I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Lien.
Okay, is that better? Awesome. All right, so thank you all for being here. I think that you'll find that we are going to be engaging in some deep conversations, some very thoughtful conversations. I'm honored to be moderating this panel today to talk about efforts on inclusion. And what we want to do is highlight the work of the different organizations that are represented on this panel, really think about things that need to be considered to fully reach equity in computing and in STEM and in the makerspace world, because I think we do want to be inclusive and increase our own awareness of equity issues and how they play out in our everyday work and our everyday lives as well. I've encouraged the panelists to share their honest thoughts about race and inclusivity, because the reality is that still today we see underrepresentation with students of color, with women in this discipline, and with students with disabilities. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. So I have some general questions for the panel, and then we'll ask individualized questions as well too. All right, so the first question I'd like to ask the panel, and any one of you can start. Maybe Jannie can kick us off, but the first question is, tell us a little bit about your organization, and then also speak to some of the challenges that you have experienced in raising awareness for inclusivity, and what efforts have helped break those barriers for improving equity with underrepresented groups that you work with?
Wow, that's a long question. All right, so I'll start by letting you guys know that NCWIT, the National Center for Women in Information Technology, is dedicated to increasing the meaningful participation of women in tech. So we work with over 1,100 organizations, companies, nonprofits, entities in the government, K-12 organizations, to bring awareness and change the culture within the tech industry, but covering the entire ecosystem. So we start working with students in K-12 through our K-12 programs, and then we do work within the corporate space, again, to bring our research-based promising practices to these organizations. So. As we know, women are vastly underrepresented in computing fields. And the idea, at least for my role within the K-12 Alliance, is that we start educating, we start reaching students very early on, exposing them to role models, exposing them to opportunities to experience creating with technology, and that they're supported through a large community of like-minded individuals called the Aspirations in Computing Community. So currently, our Aspirations in Computing Community has over 10,000 women that are part of it. It's an active, very supportive, nurturing, and encouraging group of women who are basically in the same journey together, pursuing tech and addressing issues that affect them directly, whether they're in high school or in colleges or in the workforce.
Great, thanks.
Good morning, and happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I represent the UNCF, and also I wear two hats today. One is UNCF, and then the other is CS for Philly, which is a recent initiative that was launched late last year in 2017. In my capacity as Senior Director for STEM Initiatives, I oversee the entire STEM portfolio for the UNCF. And just a note about the UNCF for those who do not know, the tagline of mine is a terrible thing to waste, but we've added but a wonderful thing to invest in, and we're focused on historically black colleges and universities. We were founded in 1944, primarily by the leader of Tuskegee Institute at the time, Frederick Patterson. Dr. Patterson launched the UNCF as an effort to support historically black colleges and universities. I am a proud graduate of Morehouse College and Morehouse School of Medicine and Harvard School of Public Health, so I have a deep relationship with HBCUs. What we've been trying to do over the past, I would say, 5 years is really connect HBCUs and the African American community to Silicon Valley with the idea of creating pipelines and pathways and build out an ecosystem of relationships between our colleges, universities, faculty, and students with the tech community. Because I don't have enough to do during the day, I work at CS for Philly with my wife in Philadelphia. We try to build out some capacity around computer science and tech at the K-12 level. This has given me an interesting view of the entire pipeline from K-12 all the way out to career for African Americans, and that's pretty much informed the work that we've been trying to do over the past few years.
Hi, good morning. Beth from Tech Kids Unlimited. I'm a mom. In 1990, in 2000, my son, my second child, was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And then what has perceived has been a long journey, a continuous journey. He always loved technology, but there was no place for me to send him to because he needed a supportive, nurturing environment. So I was an educator working in the arts-related field, and I just sort of did a little switch. But computer science is very much like the arts. And I founded Tech Kids Unlimited with him, with my son Jack, who really, he wanted to be here next time. And he is 19 now, and we teach technology and computer science principles to kids on the autism spectrum, and we serve 300 kids. Our partner is NYU Tandon School of Engineering in downtown Brooklyn, and our kids are amazing, and they're talented, and they can code, and they really need to be part of the future workforce. But they have to be taught differently, and they have to be taught individually. And you know, I'm going to work really hard to make sure that many of these kids that otherwise would have been placed in residences maybe 20 years ago are going to get jobs. So that's us.
Beth, while you have the
Yeah.
microphone, can you also speak to, you know, what have been the barriers that you've challenged in setting up your
Yeah.
organization, and also how have you, what things are you doing
Yeah.
to overcome?
So one of the things that's really hard for us is things like just saying like the social justice movement or even diversity, because people don't think of neurodiversity as diversity, which I like to think as the 21st century version of diversity, because we're all probably going to be disabled in some way, because you know we're living longer, and things like macular degeneration, cognitive issues, strokes, etc. Hopefully we'll all live till 100, but we're not going to be the sprite, you know, cognitive individuals that hopefully we all are today. So this is a real issue, not only for students who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum, but just in general. And I really wish that we could really think about including disability into the definition of diversity. And a lot of times when I'm talking to funders, you know, or PR people or things like that, I have to sort of make the case that these set of individuals, they need jobs, and you know they need funding and they need jobs, and this whole piece around disabilities is really not something that the funding world is really thinking about, and it's not really something that curriculum-wise, in terms of even the national CS curriculum, is thinking about either. So it's sort of like an uphill battle for us, and we're like I like to say we're like the little engine that could, climbing up the hill, and our students really love to be producers, and they should be, and they're really, really good at it, but they need support, and they need maybe job carving, and they need, you know, they need lists of stuff to do, and they don't self-advocate, but it's all there. They're coachable. They are coachable, and we need to give them the chance. So for me, that's a big challenge, is like the funding and the press in terms of like why what we're doing is important. That answers.
Great, yeah. So not either of you didn't talk to challenges or, you know, things that you're working on to overcome those barriers. But,
So Latinas are my second role as a Tecnologicas program manager. I focus on working and bringing awareness to the Latino community, specifically young Latinas, targeting middle school age girls, to get informed about what careers in technology are all about. But then more importantly, reaching the families. Oftentimes, our students get home to an empty house or to grandparents. Parents are working 2-3 jobs. They don't necessarily see computer science as a prestigious or as the prestigious career that it is. So they don't understand it. So reaching the families, bringing the message of the campaign, which is you can achieve amazing things through technology. I think it's the biggest challenge. So reaching the parents, and not just, so we do have a media campaign. We have PSAs that air on Univision stations nationwide, but that's still, it's not enough. You know, parents are not necessarily glued at home watching TV, Univision stations. Grandparents maybe watching the novelas in the afternoon. But so the idea is that the challenge is that we want to reach more parents. We want to bring information to parents, cross that digital divide that exists in Latino households, and normalize the computing profession.
Great.
Yeah, I think there's some real structural barriers, and then there's some informal issues that African Americans face at each level, whether you're talking about K-12 or higher ed. At the higher ed level, where we're connecting students who attend HBCUs who are majoring in computer science and computer engineering, there's a real basic lack of relationship between ecosystems like Silicon Valley and other places around the country with an understanding about the quality and the talent production that HBCUs have been producing over decades. Yeah. So that was the first problem and barrier that we solved by bringing just about the entire community out to the Valley each year. This year will be our 6th year, and we'll have about 150 of the top computer science, computer engineering majors to come out to the Valley to get a chance to tour and engage with tech employees from different companies. We have a 5-year partnership with Google. We have a emerging partnership with Facebook and some other tech companies in the Valley. And that's been a very inspiring approach that we've taken, and I think has produced some results. We're actually now thinking about building out an auxiliary campus here in the Valley for HBCU students. So there's some really cool things that we're trying to do to really deal with that issue. But the core of the problem that I can see is K-12. You know, K-12 is the fountainhead of talent for all communities, including African American communities. So that is really struggling right now. K-12 is, in my view, very dysfunctional. You have most of the large urban school districts that are almost completely underwater with regards to performance and financing. And I think communities that are bound by public K-12 systems struggle to really figure out, well, how can we get access to high quality computer science education? Right. And so that really lends itself to a much broader conversation around content knowledge and also skills development. And so we're beginning to try to work with a variety of initiatives to address that issue.
Yeah, so while you're on that topic, you have talked about responsibilities that stakeholders in education and in industry and in policy making, you know, responsibilities that they really need to own to help with these problems that we're having in K-12. Can you speak a little bit more to what you mean about, you know, what those responsibilities are, how that plays out in our work and in our role?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we take an all-in approach to this work. You know, in the end, I always say, you know, the end goal of STEM education or any educational reform initiative is not more education, it's the economy. I mean, at some point, people need jobs, and you're either going to get a job or create a job or do both, and you know, either in succession or in parallel. So the end goal from that perspective, if we want the American economy to reflect the population, which is increasingly brown and black, more brown than black, I should say, almost a 3-to-1 ratio. There's more Latinos than there are African Americans. But the truth is that if that's our demographic destiny, then the economy should reflect that as well. But it's not. And so there are some real structural barriers that we see. And so every sector has a role to play and a responsibility. The private sector has a role to play. Companies, tech companies, whether they're in the Valley or not, should reach out to communities of color, should engage in partnerships with nonprofit organizations that are working in those communities to help bring internships, awareness about tech careers, et cetera. The government has a role to play as well. And communities themselves have a role to play. I mean, in the Black community, we have a lot of different organizations. Mine is just one, There's the Urban League, there's NAACP, there's other incumbent or legacy organizations that need to be engaged and involved, and to some extent they are beginning to do that. But it's not enough. I mean, we need to really galvanize. I was listening to the great presentation that Cameron gave about Code.org and its approach. A 26% increase in APCS of African Americans is not enough. We need a multiple. I mean, we need to be at the 4 to 5x just to get to some parity level using that one metric. So I think everybody has to be all in. We need to have folks working together, public-private partnerships that engage stakeholders within communities, et cetera, need to galvanize and work together.
Right, right, absolutely.
So an interesting conversation that I was having last night was, we know that African Americans and Latinos are only about 4% of the computing workforce in the country. However, they're being asked to do the work to get more African Americans and Latinos into computing. So they're asking to do the heavy lifting. So we were talking about, it's 4% of this population, of this workforce, doing the work for everybody else. So the idea is that we have stakeholders, not just African Americans and Latinos or people with disabilities, just everybody should be part of this effort. Everybody should be sort of doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah, got it, right. Well, on that note, the idea that, I'm going to stick to this K-12 notion here because I do think that plays a big part of it. The idea that K-12 education now has a significant responsibility or a role to be inclusive and to provide opportunities for students into these disciplines, I think, has been evolving in the last 10 years. There's been a lot of work around that as well. Do you see any differences between now and let's say 10 years ago? And if so, what are those differences? And help us kind of move, forward. Like what does it really look like for you to have reached equity in the work that you're doing and with the students that you're working with?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I tend to be more radical than most folks. I'm the son of two educators. Both my parents taught in the school district of Philadelphia. My wife worked for the school. She's the real educator in the family. She's been in K-12 for her whole entire life. And having engaged at least 3 major urban school districts, myself personally, to try to bring STEM education. I'm a life scientist by training, so my background really was in the biological life sciences. And I got to tell you, I think after having spent almost 2 decades trying to work with the formal system, I'm almost at the point where I think I've arrived at the same place that Bill Gates arrived over 10 years ago. I actually think the system should just be blown up, and we need to just start over. That's probably not going to be possible, but the formal, to put that in terms we can deal with, the formal environment I think is very difficult to work in because of the policy, the rules and regulations, the disincentives. I find it just to be next to impossible to make substantive change in a reasonable time frame. Where I think there's wonderful opportunities and where I think we can actually lean into to make the kind of changes we need is in the informal environment. And I think that's where both public and private stakeholders can actually make a huge difference and are making significant strides. There's a lot of good folks doing great things at various levels of scale in cities and towns across the country. The problem that they have is that they lack the resources, the capital, to bring them to a level where they're impacting the number of kids and families that they want to, they're aspirationally speaking, want to. But it's clear to me that for all of us who want to move the needle for our kids and for our communities, we have to figure out how to deliver a high quality service and product to kids and communities where their on-ramp gives them access and equity to hopefully college and career. And I'll say one last thing. As much as we promote and will continue to promote college going, there's the other aspect of it that's equally important, that's acquiring skills. When we talk to, it's interesting to talk to companies like Google. Every time I go there, I talk to the engineers themselves, because I always want to get the real perspective of how they actually landed there. How did you get to a Google from wherever you came from? And almost invariably, they say they give me the same story, some version of the same story, where they learned how to code, either on their own or they had somebody in their family or their environment to teach them or give them some guidance and feedback. A lot of our kids in the Black community just don't have access to that. They just don't. And so I think the more that we can provide that kind of access, mentorship, et cetera, at scale, then we'll start to see how the needle can move for those kids.
So I really feel like at least the New York City Department of Education, which has 1 million students, is totally failing special needs students. They bundle them into specific diagnosis, and then the students, because we see them on the ground, have a real sense of learned helplessness where they can't do stuff, they don't want to make a decision or anything like that, because someone is standing over their shoulder that is probably telling them what to do. It's really bad also in New York because we have the regents, which are awful, and so many students don't even get a high school diploma because you have to pass a certain number of regents, and there's been a real kickback with special needs parents around that. And I really just want to say that I wish everyone here, like I just counted, there's like 25 people here, if you could go back to where you're from, whether it's not-for-profit foundation, the district, a state policy, and just do 2 things. One is create a program specifically serving kids with autism spectrum disorder and advertise it that way. This is a program for students, and put extra counselors and teachers, because that's really all they need. We need extra staff support for them in the classroom because they can do the work. And if anyone out there could just hire a person with disabilities. So those 2 things I think would be so wonderful if you could go back home when you're finished with this amazing conference and just really think, how can I incorporate students with ASD in my programs or policy or anything. I also agree with you that the informal education system is amazing. All the grassroots people that come up that are trying to move the needle. But I feel like if society as a whole, like everyone that is here, doesn't really start thinking about what we're going to do with the 500,000 students that are coming up into adulthood with autism spectrum disorder more than ever, because it's 1 in 58 now, then they're all going to be sitting on the couch collecting Social Security income. And that's what they're going to be doing. And we need to find a place for them in society, and they need to have a meaningful life, and they can contribute. And more than just gathering the shopping carts at Target. That's fine too, but they really can contribute.
In different ways, for sure, yes. So in just a little bit, we're going to open up questions for the audience. But before we do that, I want to ask you another question about giving advice to folks in the audience who might just be beginning this kind of work and who are really trying to consider ways to be inclusive as much as possible. So you gave an example of, think about autistic people and include them and advocate for them. So that's one idea. What are some other things that they can consider if they're just beginning this work of thinking of being inclusive?
Well, I would say the first thing is to get connected. This is a first step. You're meeting people who are doing similar work to the work that you want to do, so don't reinvent the wheel. Just find out who's doing it well, and do it together. I don't believe that there's a need to be another Tecnolochicas campaign. If there's somebody out here, I know Alberto spoke earlier about the work that they do through the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. I'm like, that's right. I need to go and speak to Alberto because we got to work together. We got to just amplify each other's efforts as opposed to recreate them. So I would say that start off with connections. NCWIT K-12 Alliance is free to join for nonprofit organizations and academic institutions. You also have the CS for All consortium. So the resources are out there. It's just a matter of getting connected to one another to not recreate efforts.
Right. Great.
Yeah, I would underscore that. Well said. No need to reinvent the wheel, but I do think the opportunity exists for organizations to network with each other, identify common cause, align mission and goals as much as possible, figure out where the value add is to expand. And I think there needs to be a much bigger collective ask to the philanthropic community and to the corporate responsibility community. I think the private sector gives very little, and in the era of declining federal and state government investments, I think we're going to have to figure out how to scale initiatives with meager resources, but then ask for much greater investment from the private sector. Ultimately, we're doing the work of preparing the workforce, so therefore, I think it's a certainly valid ask to the private sector to be co-investors in this process.
Okay. So I think we're ready to open up questions for the audience, and I welcome you to consider ways to connect with these panelists up here, and feel free to ask them
I have
their
no.
questions. Yeah.
Could you say your name and your organization, please?
My name is Geraldine Rodriguez. I'm the co-founder at the Knowledge House in New York. I have a question about how the corporate sector has responded to some of your initiatives. So for Beth specifically, have you gotten any feedback at all about how corporate America is hiring students with disabilities, like their hesitations, how their hiring practices had to change?
Right.
And then for Chad, I just want to know, have you seen the industry actually shift their traditional hiring practices for like HBCUs or the partnerships that you're talking about? We know that traditionally, like tech people are referred by other employees that work at the companies, or the tech companies go to like the Stanfords and the MITs to hire. So what disruption have you been seeing?
Okay, for Tech Kids Unlimited, on the funding piece, it's really hard. I mean, I'm basically like the full-time fundraiser for Tech Kids Unlimited now, and I sort of wear the banner on my forehead wherever I go. And even, I have a funny thing, like I'll leave, like I'll be home, my son will see me, and I'll be like, okay, you had dinner, I have to leave now. And he's like, Mom, are you going to try to get money for Tech Kids Unlimited? And I'm like, yeah. I have some corporate funders who get us, and that I would say, one of my funders always says that the reason that she funds people is the personal relationships more than anything. The blind applications that I apply for are never any good luck. Like Best Buy, has an application that we rejected for, Even Autism Speaks rejected us for a $5,000 grant. It's craziness, but developing the relationships with the funders over a long period of time of come see our program, that has helped. It's like massaging. Wait, and then I forgot your other question, the corporate, and then. Oh, yeah. So that's what I wanted to tell you. So I just came back from Microsoft about 2 weeks ago. There was there was a pretty big, it was like the third Autism at Work Summit through at Microsoft in Redmond. And it was really, some companies are trying to hire people on the spectrum. companies like Microsoft and HP and Ernst Young and PricewaterhouseCoopers. Here's the problem with that. They are only hiring the very highest functioning people on the spectrum, who we traditionally call people with Asperger's. So they're completely academic. They may have poor social emotional skills. Plus, they only want to hire people that have gone through college, having a BS in computer science, which for our students at Tech Kids Unlimited, many of them either may or may not go to college, like we're just starting a college access program. They don't know about college. We have a parent who, her son graduated a special needs school, he got a diploma, and when I spoke to him, I was like, well, aren't you going to community college? And then I spoke to the mother, and the mother said, the school said he can't do it. And I'm like, but he can. I know he can do it. He can do it, there's help, there's special programs. Again, like this learned helplessness, like just like put our kids in a corner over there and, you know, they'll do something, but it just, they necessarily won't contribute to society. So it's a very, very big issue, because also for people on the autism spectrum, we started sort of therapizing them in about 1994. So right now, we have a culture of therapized kids who are about 26 years old, who went through OT, PT, speech, ABA, and they are, like I said before, coachable. Like they can do stuff, but the world of sort of special needs has not caught up to who the students are. If that answers.
So we have, over the past 6 years, engaged a variety of companies in the Valley, some of them big, typical names like Google, Facebook, et cetera, and then some small companies as well. And so a couple of observations. Engineers like to solve problems, but they like to solve the problems that they see. And so the problems that they don't see, they're blind to. And so this issue of normative behavior becomes critical, because those who have or who are empowered to make decisions about hiring, et cetera, set up algorithms for hiring that are reflective of both what they see and what they don't see. And the things that they don't see often are race, gender, disability, et cetera. And so, for instance, the manner in which university-facing programs that a lot of these companies have, which are well-intended, fall short, because when they engage communities of color, they don't understand why it matters that there's a certain way about how things are done at a historically black college or Hispanic serving institution or wherever. People bring their culture with them. Engineers often, scientists are like this too, so I don't want to just blame it on engineers. Life scientists are the same way. They tend to think that data is supreme and there's no culture to data. Well, that's not true. There are a lot of numbers between 0 and 1, most of them irrational. And so that's human behavior. And so I think in dealing with companies, you have to simultaneously deal with the things that are upfront and obvious in terms of the numbers of underrepresented, et cetera, figuring out ways to engage. But then you've kind of got to walk around the landmines that they don't see, which is difficult. It's not an easy thing. And so part of what we've tried to do, and with some success, is build relationships between our campuses, our faculty, our students, with the actual hiring managers, with the engineers at these companies. That seems to mitigate against some of the hidden landmines and so forth. And we're just beginning to engage. There's some interesting platforms out there. I'll name one, ProSky, which is one that we're looking at, that helps build those kinds of authentic relationships between the engineers, the hiring managers, and the students. So we're beginning to explore technology that can help us engage in a way that displays skills and abilities that these companies can recognize and value. And that seems to be working a little bit. So I hope does that answer your question? Yeah.
I have a
Yes.
I have a question for Chad. because you mentioned the term. My name is Loretta Cheeks, and my nonprofit is in Arizona called Strong Ties. Great to see you, Beth. I'm looking for you. Yes. And so the question is, you mentioned this term access, and this is in the context of a world having access, a world view of access, and also, I wrote something else down, but I'll get back to that. But the question is, when you say access to people and argue or try to reason about access, particularly for Black and brown communities, and we have libraries with free, I'm being a Democrat advocate, okay? We have libraries with free internet, code.org and the like, where you have services that are available and free. How do you tell me that you have an access problem?
I think it's a great question, because you're right. I mean, you're right to point that out. The internet is, well, at least for the moment, free, at least for the moment. And yeah, you're right. We have spaces and places where the public can engage content online and off. Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs exist as well. Where I've gotten to in my short 52 trips around the sun is a deeper understanding about the cultural context in which people and communities exist. Culture is the matrix in which priorities are determined, decisions are made, and policies are executed. And so we have a cultural issue that we need to deal with. I think on some level, youth culture is and has been for some time anti-intellectual, anti-academic, and anti-achieving. And that's just keeping it real. It does not mean that Black and brown youth can't achieve. It just means if you want to move the needle in those communities, and we do, then we've got to acknowledge some of the cultural issues that surround our kids. Some of them, I would say the majority of them, they're not necessarily cognizant of it. I call it the dark matter, if you will, of our community. It's there, you know it's there, because you engage it. And it's hard, because it's very hard to change a mindset. And then, of course, our communities are surrounded structurally by policies that operate against, in some cases, any kind of movement to deal with effectively access and creating opportunities. I mean, you would think that it would, all the stuff that Hardy, Pertovi, and Cameron and others have been talking about in code.org and CS for All, I mean, it's not rocket science, right? We need to make sure that all of our kids have access to computer science. Well, where are the superintendents here? Where are the principals here? Where are all the people that actually operate and control, have the levers of our system? They should be here talking with you guys, but they're not, because nobody's holding them accountable. So I think, yes, we do have points of access, you're right, and you're right to point that out. And I don't necessarily have all the answers either. I'm a parent too, I have 2 kids. I should be careful, this is being recorded. My wife and I have 2 kids. And watching them grow up, and we're educators. I have a PhD in life sciences. My wife has a master's degree from Harvard Ed School. But we have to fight at home sometimes over usage of devices, over games, which movies to watch. All this is culture. And if we're struggling to do that, then what are other parents struggling with who have immediate concerns at the lower ends of the Maslow hierarchy? So we've got to figure out how to move culture and deal with the things that surround our kids and our communities in order to get to access and equity.
Can I add a little bit to that too? Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that I do think it's a lot to do with culture as well too, but I also think that inherently our educational system doesn't have a true trajectory for students to be integrated with the advances in computing that are happening today in our society. I mean, we talk about technology, we talk about the use of devices, we talk about, the importance of them having these computational skills, but I honestly don't think that we have a true and clear trajectory for integrating that into our educational system. Right now, we are still struggling. We are still struggling. Our K-16 system is still struggling with how to do that well with all of the technological advances that are happening. And it's even a little bit worse because those diverse perspectives in the advances in technology that are occurring are missing all of you. They're missing the perspectives of our Black children, of our Hispanic children. They're missing those perspectives right now. And so, I do think that it's going to get better because these kids that are coming through the system now are a lot smarter than we think they are, and they're figuring it out for themselves, and they're going to be the ones. I'm hoping that all of our efforts that we have talked about today for inclusivity are going to help our kids have their own voices to say, hey, something needs to change, and I think that's what this is ultimately about, is creating those voices within the students that are currently going through the system now to stand up and say, something's got to change. We can't be the only ones trying. We've got to prepare them with the voices that they need to make that change happen.
I wanted to respond to your question as well, and you kind of started down that path. It's good. So an experience that would benefit a white middle-class boy will not necessarily have the same results for a Black kid living in poverty. So although there are all those resources that are available to anyone, I don't know if that serves the right needs or moves them in the way that they would like to move forward. And I think that, to your point, those interventions or those programs need to be designed by the community, with the community that it goes to serve. So, yeah, the code for all is not really effective.
If I could just add one quick thing, it's like inclusion shouldn't be an afterthought. It should be embedded and intentionally programmed into everything that we're doing. So it can't be like, oh, by the way, we forgot the brown kids. No, we need to be thinking about them from the start.
I was interested in something you said, Chad, about you would just blow up the system. And I'm wondering what your vision...
Metaphorically, yes.
Of course. Nobody wants to literally blow anything up. But I'm curious about what your vision is for, the new thing. And I think a lot of what you were saying, Lien, about change and what, the desperation we have for needing change is super interesting. And you're clearly super passionate about it. And I think that we all are. And I really would love to hear more about what it would look like on the other side.
Great question. Very different. The old standard rows of desks and sage on the stage needs to go away. There's a really wonderful video by Sir Edward Robinson, I think his name is, where he talks about the industrial model of education and so forth. I love that because he's far more eloquent than I can be. But the concepts and the principles that he's discussing about how our K-12 system was structured. If you go back and you read about the Committee of 10, which basically set the foundation upon which high school curriculum was developed over 100 years ago, and you compare that against where we are, not much has really changed. Yeah, it's a 19th century model, exactly. So what would you do differently? Number one, kids like to learn in an authentically challenging yet rigorous environment that connects with real problems that's in the real world. We have an interesting challenge now. So I was talking with my wife the other day and I was like, for the first time in human history, children have access to all of the world's content ever created, ever, at their fingertips. So content and information is ubiquitous. You could argue that, well, because of the digital divide, not everybody has, similar access. But let's do a thought experiment and say we eliminated that digital divide. Everybody had a device. So it's not content that's really the issue. It's how do you curate that content? What is the meaning of that content? What do you do with that content in helping your efforts to solve problems that face humanity in whatever sector you're talking about? Kids, I mean, our kids, every time I talk to my daughter about science, she loves to get deeper into, well, what does that mean? What does cancer therapy mean? I'm now, the computational dad, so every opportunity I have, I start talking to them about what in essence is computational thinking. But getting them to solve problems, getting them to think about the meaning of what they're learning and how that could be applied. Project-based learning, yes, problem-centered learning. And oh, by the way, we have this wonderful thing called the internet, so all these enterprise-based technological solutions on digital platforms, there's almost a treasure trove of opportunity to engage students. So we're at, just one quick example, we're working with a company called Codio, CODIO.com, which is a company that has developed I would say a high-grade, high-quality computer science educational platform where you can basically put any stack on that platform and you can teach and learn in any language that you want. We're actually using that to network the historically black colleges that we engage. Well, there's no reason why that couldn't be brought down to the K-12 level either. And there's some other platforms, it's not the only one. So I think there's some wonderful ways to do this where the learning environment would look very different than where we are now.
Lien, you have about 5 minutes. Do you want to do final comments or take more questions?
I think we could do more questions.
Okay. Probably 2 more questions.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Lien. I'm from CS for All. My question to you has to do with the way that we're observing the system. So we constantly talk about the color and shape of the butts in our seats as the problem. We don't have enough of women, we don't have enough students of color, we don't have enough students with disabilities, we don't have enough Latinas in the system. And I think my question to you is, how do we reframe the conversation where the problem isn't the number? The number instead is the symptom of the problem, right? If you have a fever and you go to the doctor's office, the doctor doesn't say, oh, you have a fever. The doctor says, okay, let's figure out why you have a fever. The fever is the symptom. And so how do we shift this conversation from this observational number as problem to observational number as this is the symptom of the larger problem? And I think especially if we look at only about 3 to 5% of kids major in computer science. This isn't working for all white boys. This is only working for a very, very small number of students in our population. And so we have to blow up the system for everybody, not just for our students of color and underrepresented minorities.
I actually think, Leanne, that a lot of, as you say, brown and black children are not diagnosed with disabilities. And I think that when you're not diagnosed with reading disabilities or ADHD or whatever from a young age, kindergarten, that it affects your whole entire learning career. And then it puts you down a path of, maybe not academic success, because if you have trouble reading or you have trouble focusing or whatever it might be, then you don't want to be in school. And I'm always, fascinated in a way by the fact that we get parents who are the child's in 8th grade and all of a sudden the parent says, oh, and by the way, we just, the school recommended that we do a neuropsych. And it turns out the child has, XYZ type of, disabilities. And I'm like, wait a second, that just didn't pop up. Where were you in kindergarten? 5 years old. So I just think that there's a lot of missed opportunity in terms of helping kids learn, because learning doesn't come naturally to so many kids these days. And we are not doing a good enough job of helping diverse kids learn from the get-go, because they're not being diagnosed and they're not being helped. That's my
I think we can just simply reframe the issue of numbers to a social justice issue. This is if you want to, whether you're white, brown, black, boy, girl, disability, or no disability, if we frame this in a way that we're talking about access to computer science education as a social justice issue, then all students benefit from that. So.
Yeah, I do have a similar take on that too, because we've had this conversation before, but I think of it as the quality of the educational experiences that students experience depending on the school that they attend. I mean, that matters a lot. It matters a lot that, you know, students have a different experience in a STEM academy versus students living in a school where the community, you know, is living in poverty. And we could reframe the conversations to that, but I would say also that if we reframe the conversation in that way, we will still find that our black and brown students, you know, are still the ones that are being affected the most in terms of access and quality of education and computing and STEM and the makerspace.
You know, to your point, Lien, about numbers, I've been sort of moving in my own thinking about fractions, and you know, we always say, well, there's 5% or 5 out of 100, and it's interesting. The language actually is kind of important. You say 5 out of 100. You know, well, that 5 that we're looking at are connected to the other 95 to make up that whole pie, right? And so what I found growing up as a black boy, now a black man, looking at my own communities, we do have quite a few talented African Americans in our own community who struggle to connect, make meaningful connections within their own group. And so in order to move the needle, it's not just about moving it from 1 or 2 or 3. It's really about addressing the equity and the access issue as a community, as a whole. So we want to move from 5 out of 100 to, you know, more of the denominators becoming numerators. We're all numerators here in this room. But for every one of us, there's, you know, thousands who we interact with and impact. The other point I would say is this: I don't really think we as a country are all that serious about this issue. I don't think so. You know who is serious? China, India. I've been to both. And when you talk about policy and planning, I mean, they're not playing around. And yet we're stuck in this national conversation about stuff that in the end isn't really going to matter because it has no economic significance. I don't know how to, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I can tell you, if we can figure out how to connect what I would call, bear with me, Pookie, Ray Ray, and Mamanum in the hood to Ma and Pa Kettle out in the Rust Belt, if we could figure out how to, what's the common denominator there, and invest in solutions that will help move the needle in those two communities, I actually think we would actually usher in a new era of American innovation. But we've got to get serious about that. And I don't know what the answers are, but I just know we just have to get serious about it.
So we have one more question that.
We actually are at time, so I'd like you to just
I
have your.
apologize
It's okay.
for that.
There's lots of time after. You don't have to leave the room.
All right. So I want to just say thank you to the panelists for participating today in the conversations, and thank you all for being here and
Thank
asking
you,
your
Lynn.
questions. We can
Thank you for
very much.
moderating.
You're welcome.
Thank
And
you.
You can stick around for a little bit if you have any more questions. Thank you.